scoot back here, sorry about that. So big picture view. I know Pastor Scott used the phrase, I think last week, of 30,000 foot view, right? Because as we're doing this, especially as we've taught before, as we've done the video teaching for Church Without Borders, just when we were doing some work with Genesis, I don't remember how many months we spent, but months delving into Genesis. So you would spend so the idea of, okay, Genesis 1 week, Exodus the next week, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, like in a week? Are you making this up? But no, we're not. So yeah, we can spend some time, just looking in the various particulars. But if we're doing big picture, here's some big picture to just keep in mind. So Tanakh may or may not be something in Christian arena. So Tanakh is Torah, Navim, and Ketuvim. So Torah would be the Pentateuch, the 5 books. Those are the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? That's the law. And then Navim, these are going to be your prophets. There are 8 books. And then Ketuvim, writings, poetry, psalms. Those are 11 books. As a good biblical scholar, you'll say, that doesn't equal 39. It does not, because we have 24 books in our Jewish scriptures, because we don't have 1st and 2nd Samuel, we just have Samuel. We don't have 1st and 2nd Kings, we just have Kings. Ezra and Nehemiah, 1 scroll, not 2 books. So counting is a little different. So, but it's still the same big picture, all right? In the Protestant version, and how we're going to read it, we're going to have 39 books. So don't let those numbers throw you off. We divide books differently, and that's okay, all right? But we still have the Torah, the Pentateuch, those 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We still have the prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets. We still have the Ketuvim, the writings. So you're going to have Ruth. You're going to have the Psalms. You're going to have the Song of Songs, right? You're going to have those other writings that are in there. These are still these books that we're going to find. This is the big picture. And one of the main things I just always want to make sure to get across to folks as we're in here, so we're reading and you go, but what about, we're looking at the characters. But the main character, the main point, this is always about God, right? So we get connected to, we're connected to Moses. We're tied into Aaron. We say, but Abraham and, well, yeah, the main character is always God. What is God doing? What does this tell us about God, the nature of God? So, inasmuch as we connect with those characters, when you're reading this, realize the main narrative is always about God. It'll help that perspective. And then I just asked if, so JEDP is going to help. This is redaction theory. So these books, especially as we're looking at the Torah, the Pentateuch, these first 5 books, there are 4 main schools of theory, thought, editors that have come in: the Yahwist and Elohim writers, the Deuteronomical historians, and the priestly writers or editors. These are all folks who came in and at one time or another edited, redacted as the scrolls were coming together. So the early writers, and they had different names for God. So Yahweh, Elohim. All right, the Lord our God, the Lord Almighty. So as you're reading, you may see at one time where Lord is capitalized, all L-O-R-D, fully capitalized. Maybe not in your version, I don't know, but you'll find, and sometimes when you see those repetitions of stories, you'll be like, why is this in here twice? Okay. Or the astute among you, of course, would be, why are there two creation stories? Well, because you have a people coming together, and so when I teach this to like confirmands, I say, any of you come from, let's say, a blended family? Whose family has the more important family narrative? Well, you're equal, aren't you? So this family had this creation narrative, this family had this creation narrative, but both of them, it's about God. So here we go. This is how God works with humanity. And we're weaving our stories together about how God is in relationship with humanity. So the Yahwehs, the Elohim, so these are all folks, and the Deuteronomical historians, when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, you're going to look back and go, didn't I just read this in Exodus? And the answer is, yeah, you did. So, okay, but they rediscovered these books, and it was an important time in history, and there it is, and then they're editing, and then finally, at that final, the priestly writers had to put that final touch as they're being dispatched, right? So you have to put that edit in, and a lot of what we're going to see here is going to be very important in terms of what are the details of the law? How do we follow this law? These editors had some things to say here in Exodus. And this is why it's important to understand this. All right? So, any of those you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'm going to erase a lot of this as we kind of get into what's happening here. So, yes. No, go, yes.
That shade we put all the way down. I know it'll make it darker in here, but it's okay.
Yes, we can. Who knows? There we go. I was going to say, who knows how to do that? So, yeah, no, that's good.
That's why I moved, because the glare is bad.
All right. And other than the shade, I guess maybe what I want to know is, are there any questions on this before I just jump right into all of my Exodus stuff as I do big picture? Thank you, Mark.
I haven't done anything yet.
Well, I have no idea at all how to do that. Every time I've tried to do that, I have failed miserably.
It's okay.
I could move.
I'll manage. I will manage.
All right, well, I'll start teaching a little bit, and then if we can't manage to successfully do this, I'll move to a different spot because, well, no, don't worry about it because glare is awful. So, do we have any questions on this before we move into really diving into Exodus and what the Exodus story is about? This overview makes sense?
Yeah.
We're good? Wonderful. Okay. So I will pivot my teaching position.
You
So
know
that,
what, you stay. I think if I turn your chair like this.
okay.
Yes, it's actually much better. It's funny.
All right, then I will not pivot my teaching position.
Thanks.
All right. Excellent. Right. So for me, and probably as you saw when you saw the Exodus piece come out, Exodus for me is that amazing pivot book where we have something radically different happening from the stories that were told, had been told, the type of story that is told about God and or a God. in relationship with people. What we have in this instance is an understanding that Moses, hi Barb, welcome. Oh, there we go. There's some handouts in the chair next to you, and after, when class is over, I'll go over a review of this for you. We're just launching into Exodus itself right now. So,
Okay.
all right, take a moment to catch your breath, but we're glad you're here. So, in this narrative, what we have is character in the person of Moses, right? Who isn't, the son of God, or is not in any way, shape, or form characterized as someone special or elite. In fact, everything in the Exodus story makes it very clear that Moses is painfully human and flawed, right? And you have, again, the key is about God. So you have this basic human who does these very flawed things, who says he has a hard time speaking and there's no way he can inspire anybody. And Moses has this experience then at the burning bush. And this scene from Exodus 3 to 4:17 is honestly the longest dialogue you're going to have of its sort in all of Scripture. And I don't know if when you read that particular part, you read it with any sort of eye for me. It's an eye toward almost humor, because as Moses and God are talking, this is what you're going to do. They're not going to believe me. No, really, I'm going to give you this sign. Yeah, but, okay, well then you can also do this. Yeah, I don't think so. Well, put your hand in your cloak and take it out. Really, I'm powerful. Yeah, that's not enough. Okay, how about this? Well, no. Seriously, Moses. No, God, you got to call somebody else. Okay, now I'm angry. It's just, it really is like the who's on first kind of dialogue, or any kind of conversation you've maybe had with an obstinate toddler. You're going to do this. No, I'm not. No, I'm telling you. No, I'm not. Look, I'm God. You're going to do this. No. It's funny, but we don't read Scripture as if it's funny, but it's funny. And so that's how Aaron gets involved in all of this, because at the end, when God really just, buddy, fine. Aaron, he's going to go with you. And then good old Miriam. So it's just like, it's amazing. But it's one of those pieces. There's not another story like this, because it's right on the heels of, yeah, you killed somebody. You want the very definition of not anybody who is righteous, right? So what do we know about Father Abraham, right? So in terms of the righteous and following the way, but we can look at and maybe get into the weeds a little bit more in terms of what is Scripture saying here about what is God looking for? What is this relationship all about? And what is necessary? And it all has to do with the power of God. What can God do? Not what can a human do. What can God do? Yeah.
What I thought was astounding is after that whole dialogue between God and Moses, and this just really stood out for me. You get to Exodus 4:24.
Uh-huh.
It says, the lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him.
Yes.
And I'm like, what?
What?
Well, is it-
I didn't quite understand.
That
Uh-huh.
blew my mind.
Yeah.
And
Well, is it him or his son?
No, it was.
Well, read carefully, because the rabbis debate. I know exactly the part you're talking about. Yes. Oh, that's beautiful. Yes. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for bringing that up.
And what does that act have anything to do with cutting off foreskin? It's bizarre.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay, so we'll go into that weed as well. So, all right. There are at least three different theories about what is being talked about here. So, it's important to understand some of the following things. The first being that Israel is to be understood as the firstborn son of God, all right? And whether or not Moses was circumcised or not. There's debate in there. Whether or not Moses would have circumcised his firstborn son, in debate. So all of this is going to be not part of this, but part of oral tradition and some of the Talmuds. And okay, so because Gershom possibly would have been, as the firstborn, designated to go and be part of the tribe or the spiritual leadership with Jethro, right? So as the eldest there, because Zipporah was given as gift to Moses, their firstborn would go to the father, her father, right? And again, all of this you'd only know if you were of cultural time. And so all of this ties into, and the pronoun is the trick here. And various rabbis debate, is it he was going to kill the son or he was going to kill Moses? And you have to interpret one way or the other, and we don't know which way you're meant to interpret it, so you leave it out there. But what you have here is another instance in which it's the woman who responds in action and knows apparently what is happening, what's going on, and the key components of an inactivity is not an option. So God will act, but as Moses is going forward, did he hesitate to circumcise his firstborn child because there would have been like a 3-day wait and God told him to go immediately, and so that's why he went? But he should have then chosen to circumcise the child, who is now a young adult, of course, because they were close enough. But Moses was not going to do this. And if Moses was not going to do this, how can he possibly be the one to bring all of the firstborn children? So and you can see which editor would have done this, right? So in which ways are you going to keep the laws, the covenant? Because these are the children of Abraham. And how are you understanding, because that sign of the circumcision, these are the children of Abraham and your own firstborn. So all of this is in here. Again, it's about God. It's about keeping God's laws. But you're right, you read that and go, what? Why is this here? But in the end, what we have is a salvific act and action that stops it from happening. Am I satisfied with that response? No. Am I going to keep looking? Yes. But that's what I was able to find, and whether it's relating to Moses or is it relating to either of the two sons, the rabbis are still in debate. And I can send you all that wonderful article by this great rabbi if you would like it. So if that's a yes, I'm happy to send that right out. But more discussion on that? Okay. All right. So, boom, diving back in. So, we talked about just Moses murdering. So, you know the laws of Hammurabi, which were around at the time. We talked about Moses being a murderer, and what distinguishes, because we're going to find this here. So, in Babylonia, right, so the first code with Hammurabi, it talks about the code for murder and lays that all out. And what sets this Exodus story apart is, of course, our first commandment has to do with the law of God. I am the God who brought you out of, right? So everything is in respect to God. This is who God is. This is how you honor God. This is how you do this. The cultural laws of the day, this is the punishment for this. This is right, not this, not that. Everything stems from who God is and how you are in relationship to God and God's covenant, and then people. So this is an intentional writing that says, when this action happened, because of how things were in relationship with God's people, it's how you are understanding God. This is what follows. So that stems into, if you're not keeping God's commandments, and if circumcision is one of God's commandments, then you have to follow that law. That's most important, right? Okay. You take that a little bit further. What this is trying to say is the way we serve God is to try and imitate God. And by imitating God and following that law, that means we are with our lives to bring about freedom or liberation in any way that we can. So the things that we are seeing that would enslave another or keep another down, we are not to do that, but we are to act as God would act in terms of agents of kindness, compassion, liberation, those sorts of things. And this is part of what Exodus is trying to get across to us. All right? At least I understand and believe that part of that bottom line of Exodus is that in reading it and understanding it, it changes my view of history. It changes my view of God in history, because it changes what is possible. So Exodus means that God is in relationship with human beings in a very viable and very real way, and that whatever the powers of oppression are, and however strong they are, there's never going to be an equal force, because they are but earthly forces, and God's force is stronger than that. And Exodus makes it very clear that that's what's happening. So Exodus teaches us that God will overcome any earthly power that thinks or presents itself as a godlike power or structure. And it calls us to be, we often call ourselves an Easter people. Well, we are an Exodus and Easter people, because we understand that absolute power of God, and in that there is hope, there is liberation, there is freedom, because we understand that redeeming and liberating act of God that has been a part of God's character, not just with that act of Jesus Christ, but from the very beginning stories of the law on through to that salvific act of Jesus Christ. So this is a continual narrative and understanding of who God is and has been throughout history. And nothing can ever change that. So the power of God has been doing this, enacting freedom within the world and working on behalf of this in all ways. So I've said a lot. We haven't even gotten ourselves out of Egypt yet, or we haven't grumbled in the desert yet, the wilderness, but I can start opening up for questions because I've babbled for quite some time here. So I will stop babbling. What questions have you, or would you like to begin to delve into?
I was surprised at the kind of interaction between God and the people. And,
Uh-huh.
well, maybe we could do some. I mean, I don't think of God as arguing with you. This is it, folks. There's no arguing.
Uh-huh.
You know, I said this is how we do it, and this is what we do. I mean, and when they do the ark and the and the Torah and their all the stuff, and it's exact to this, and it has to be this, and it has to be that. There's no changing this. This is how it is. I don't know that I'd have made a very good Jewish person. I would have had a hard time with. Maybe there's something I don't understand within the culture why this was so important. I mean, I understand that it was God. This was God's house. This was, but. And everybody went along and we'll do that. But then sometimes, they're grumbling now.
Yep.
Why was Moses arguing with God? I mean, God, did he really know that the people, was he wondering, why did I create this mess? I mean, these people are really giving me a hard time. And I just, the New Testament is so different. So
Yes.
My point is that Moses, I can't compare Moses and Jesus. I don't see.
That's great.
I mean, Jesus, he knew what he was doing and how he was going to do it. And this is what we're going to do, and this is God's house, and this is this, and this is that, and he's got it all. Moses, he's not so sure, and like you say, you got to have Aaron to talk for him. So that's. I had a really hard time with, I've never really, I knew what was in Exodus, but I never really thought that much about it. And it sort of got me like, I always thought that the Jewish people had to be better because they didn't need a human to show them the way. They had God. I mean, you can't pick, you know what I mean? They had less, and to me, it was easier because Jesus' humanness. Even though he was divine, he was still had our characteristics as humans. So that made it easier for me. So that's where I came with. It's hard for me to be a Jewish person, the religion and to follow all that.
Okay. I saw your hand
to
up.
address that everything was so specific. I think God was testing their obedience to him.
Ah, okay.
And with regard to Jesus and Moses, with the comparison, they both were there to redeem their people.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was sent for that reason. Moses was appointed for that reason by God. But of course, because we have free will, we will argue with God, even though we really shouldn't be. But and of course, God got frustrated with Moses, but in the end, he was there and he followed the rules. So, what else was there? And also, I thought another comparison with Moses and Jesus was that they were both threatened to be killed as babies.
Yes.
By Pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
So that those two they were for that reason they were both in similar circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I would agree about the testing the people with, because those specificities, 20 cubits, not 19 and 3/4, purple, red, gold, and this blood here and that blood there, and like,
That actually helps me understand it too, because as I was reading it, I thought, nowhere have I ever, haven't read the whole Bible, but I've read parts of it,
Mm-hmm.
seen so much detail from God, or Jesus particularly, who talked in parables. This is interesting to me, and then I thought, is this really what God said, or is this the men that are writing this that decided to put all this detail in?
Mm-hmm. So,
an engineer.
uh-huh, there you go. Knowing, I would err on the side of understanding that various writers have come in to add things and to edit, right? You've heard the God is in the details piece. That, now certainly that's Mies van der Rohe, right? Beautiful architect, if I remember. And we can understand God in the details, right? I certainly preached on the Fibonacci sequence. I see God in the greatest of minutia, and it unfolds before me, and it is wonderful. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I expect God to write down and delineate for me exactly how I am to write my term paper. In the design of something organically beautiful that I see, yes. In the same way, when something is to be built, let me tell you, I really want that uptight engineer to give me all of those painfully exacting details. And it does matter to me if there's, it's called a dovetail, when the wood, whatever it is, when the woodworkers make the wood fit like this, rather than just slapping the corners together, that makes a difference, right? Now both will work, but one is much more carefully crafted and beautiful than the other. And so when you understand that it's about the character and it's about God, and you have this understanding that God is carefully in your midst, maybe what you're trying to convey is that God is in the details, and you might go to a bit of an extreme in your editing work in saying it must be this big and it must be this big and it must be this. So, okay, if you're the last editor to get the word in, you might say that. Now that doesn't mean that I'm right about that, right? But it's a possibility that we might entertain, that you understand God in those kind of details. And so to say, God says, in the same way, you might understand that God says, you will not mix a kid with its mother's milk. We'll get that soon enough, okay? It seems like an odd sort of thing for God to say, unless you begin to understand that you have wooden bowls and milk spoils, and if you put meat in there. something's going to happen to that meat. And people are going to get really sick really fast, right? So maybe God says that so y'all don't die. Because God cares that you live. So you understand that this is about God living in relationship and caring about you and your health. God's in the details. So maybe God said that, or maybe the priestly writers said that about God, because it's all just a theory right now, but so I don't know if that opens any doors or windows for understanding, but how about plagues? What about the plagues before we've launched into some of these other details? Any ideas why all those plagues are there?
Because
What-
people are hard to convince.
Oh gosh, yes. Aren't we all stubborn, stiff-necked people? Not just those who went in the wilderness. So,
The Egyptians were the rulers, and they weren't going to let things like that bother them, I don't think.
Okay.
It wasn't until the death of the children that it really affected them in the mind.
Plus, they believed in magic, apparently, and they had a lot of
Yeah.
magicians that could do certain things.
sure.
Yeah. But then, of course, God was also hardening Pharaoh's heart.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't get what, I didn't get that. Why, that bothered me, because I was like, I don't get that.
What was that, no?
About
The
why
hardening
would God hardening
Yeah, we're
Pharaoh's
gonna,
heart.
he's gonna let you go, but then I'm gonna harden his heart and he's gonna not let you go, and so then I'm gonna do this really bad thing. And then,
Yep.
you know, he'll soften up, but I'm gonna harden his heart again.
Like, people would have hardened heart anyway, like, if that, I struggled with that.
There we go. So in Hebrew, there's a way of understanding this that rather than our English translation of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, God did not act to intervene to soften it. So God allowed Pharaoh to be Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has a hard heart, and God just let Pharaoh be Pharaoh. Right? Because when we understand, I mean, when you've had those moments, spiritual moments of awakening, do you feel, this is, forgive me for this spiritual woo-woo moment, but don't you feel that your heart is softer? Don't we use that language? Right? That compassion, my heart is softer, my heart is open. Okay? So when God's presence fills us, our heart is softer. So if God does not act to intervene, God just allows Pharaoh to be Pharaoh with that hard heart.
I also wondered if God was trying to convince his people who he was, and perhaps one plague wouldn't have been enough to truly convince them of who he was and to follow him.
Okay? It's possible. It's very possible. What do you know about the Egyptian gods?
Not much.
Okay? So the sun gods, okay? But in terms of water as well. So you have, and not just Egyptian, but in terms of the gods of that time and place. So for water or for land or for sun or for rain. So when you have these various plagues, what you can possibly symbolically understand is that you have a God in the same way as, you know, Aaron throws his staff on the ground and it becomes a serpent, and the wizards do the same thing, and then Aaron's snake eats all their snakes. So, okay, so you have a God who controls the sun. All right, darkness. You have a God that controls the water. It's blood. You have a God who controls the rain, hail. You have a God that gets, right?
So God is trying to say, I control all of it.
Yes. Right? Yeah. You see these gods of these things? I am the God of all of these things. It's possible. Again, this is not, the minute I make a definitive statement, I always get scared. But it's possible. Symbolically, you can see the various plagues as saying, right, these various gods, one God controls all of these things. I am the God of the universe. I am the God of life and death, right? And that's the hardest one of all, right? That firstborn that comes at the very end. But it's just a way of, again, it's about God. God's power. And who is this God we follow? And other kinds of questions, what is this about? Anything that you want to get into? We don't have to. I've bored you all for 45 minutes, but.
Unless I missed it, I was looking for, here are the 10 commandments.
Exodus 20.
And they're all 10 listed there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
They're going to be couched. They're couched in paragraph form, but I'm turning single pages here. Sorry about that. But Exodus 20. Then the Lord God spoke all of these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them. So, right, it follows from there. It gets easier to understand that these are the 10 Commandments when we get to verse 12. Honor your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. Right? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. So that's the kind of, right, boom, 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 boom that we're used to. But Exodus 20 is where you will find it. So that's the Decalogue.
Thank you.
So, sure. As I said, we'll get it again in Deuteronomy. So, it's all right. Anything else?
So these laws, like social responsibility things that they have in there, if you seduce a virgin, then you do this, and all of it, these are what their culture was at the time?
A lot of detail.
It's a huge amount of detail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge amount of detail, right? And so again, when I teach on this, I have people think about it in terms of duct tape. So there are the laws that pertain to God, woven up and down, God's and human. But so how are we in relationship with God and God in humanity? And then what gives it its strength? How are we in relationship with each other? That's the sideway weave, right? And that's what gives it the strength. So up and down, side to side, up and down, side to side. And you have to understand, so if you break these laws and these covenants in relationship with each other, that's the piece that you have to understand how God is in relationship with the neighbor and the other and all of that. And so what you're really doing is you're wounding your relationship with God when you are wounding this relationship with the other. And so that's why punishments might seem so harsh, but and all of these details are down. So And that's how it'll then, you think this is detailed, wait till we get to Leviticus, man. Ay. But yep. Mm-hmm.
Can you, what do those letters stand for, JEDP?
Yahweh, Elohim, Deuteronomical historian, and the priestly writers.
So God, historian, priestly?
Well, yeah, so a name for God, so yep, Yahweh. So, and the fun little thing here is that, well, anyway, yes. And I made my J like this on purpose because in translating with J's and Y's in terms of in German and the like, it's how we ended up with Jehovah's Witness. So, because, ouch, gonna pop my knee. Sorry about that. All right, you can do this, and then, and if you're writing very quickly, all of a sudden some things start to merge together, and the J and the Y flipped together, and Yehovah became Jehovah, and ta-da, all of a sudden, centuries ago. There we go. So, anyway, so, but back to this lecture. So, yes.
So back then with obviously with the culture, what was the whole issue dealing with eating bread, whether it has yeast or doesn't have yeast in it? What did the yeast represent or not represent in that culture back then? So I know that there was a lot of points where they were told to eat bread without yeast. And what was the significance of that?
In terms of just the Passover event, or so if we're moving it to the moment of the Passover event, so if you must go in haste, you do not have time for leavening to take place. And so you don't put yeast in your bread, you're just going. So leavening or allowing, so that's something you're able to do at leisure.
Right.
And so if you are moving at haste, you are unleavened bread. And so, yep. You're at haste, moving quickly at God's command or behest. Yep.
And so a lot of these have to do then still with the, like the Orthodox Jews, keeping kosher, like the milk and the meat not being mixed together.
Absolutely. Those laws of kashrut. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So, And just in terms of, so you can still, of course, be a very, very faithful Jewish person and not keep the laws of kashrut, right? So, so you can be a reform or a conservative member of the Jewish community and not keep kosher, keep the laws of kashrut. But if you are Orthodox or Hasidism, yes. Yeah. Yeah. And there are 613 laws, not just 10. So.
They have to memorize them all.
Yes. Or just go to the rabbi.
Yes.
Other questions? Anything? You can always email or text me as well. It's not like once we close the book, I say, forget it, I'm not talking about Exodus anymore.
So what is the big picture of Exodus? What would you say is the big picture of Exodus?
The big picture of Exodus is the understanding that God is intimately involved in the redeeming act with humanity, and calls humanity to be involved as well. That this is not just like a, okay, everybody for themselves. No. And that it is the ongoing work of liberation in partnership with God and humanity, and that we are called to work in partnership, and that this is the lifelong work, and that this is much more work than, I mean, we saw from the creation story and those pieces moving forward, right? But that this is the nuts and bolts. So this is where God says, I am not afraid of the muck and the mire and the mess, right? So I will come down, because the Nile is not perceived as this pretty, pristine thing, right? So the Nile is messy. And God comes to this lowly place, to these people who are hurting units, right? God hears those cries and comes down and says, you can't fight for yourself? I got you. Let's go. And that story, that ongoing story of hope and liberation does not stop. It started at the Exodus, and it continues today, and it's not just God's story, but anyone who hears it is now also responsible, right? So it's that duct tape image. God in relationship with humanity, but humanity responsible for humanity. No one should leave another out. So that's the message of Exodus, right? Because you are called to work in partnership with God, right? And every action should be one toward freeing another, toward liberating another, toward bringing another closer to hope. This is the story of Exodus. We are to be an Exodus people, an Easter people. And we are to do that because God does that. And we are to live out that message. That's our job. And if we can't do that, that means it's time for God to start doing that on our behalf, and someone else to work that on our behalf, right? Because we are the ones who are crying out, right? God helps those who cannot help themselves. It's Benjamin Franklin who said the other thing. It's Exodus that says this, right?
Can you say something about the sacrifices? Like, it talked about the sacrifices and the blood and the whatever, and I mean, part of that is so foreign, and you look at, okay, Jesus and the sacrifice, and then you're like, okay, is this supposed to be something, because you've got like the pagans, and you gotta keep the sun god happy, or you gotta keep the whatever god happy, or is it like you're trying to pay for something? It's so foreign.
It is.
Can you just like say something about that?
Absolutely. You mean like, so the animal sacrifices, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay, so this is going to sound very dismissive. I do not mean for it to sound that way. When you have a priestly class, okay, so the priestly class in inhabiting a temple, they have to eat, okay? So when you make a sacrifice at the temple, a certain amount of that is allowed to go to have the priestly class fed, right? So those kind of sacrifices serve a practical purpose. Now that's very dismissive because it's all about God, right? So you always render unto God what is God's. So if all life comes from God, you have to be willing, right? And I do not want to, I can hear my Orthodox friends in the back of my head going, what's the matter with you, right? So if everything belongs to God, then you must be willing to give to God what is God's, and God has said. I, however, am not Orthodox, so what I want to say to you is there's a very practical nature that's going on here, and it's why we don't do this anymore, because we don't have to sacrifice a chicken, because you don't have a priestly class that has to then eat that chicken. It just doesn't serve a practical nature anymore, right?
And God doesn't need a chicken.
Thank you. But I understand these narratives very much in that way. But again, I don't want to be dismissive of those who have a different understanding of that. But for me, that's my way of understanding. So the other way to understand that, of course, is the value we place on these things, right? So in an agrarian sort of economy, understanding that kind of sacrifice, if you are to sacrifice a calf, that's a much bigger thing than a dove. So maybe
it's
don't do the
your
thing.
wealth to God, basically.
It's your wealth to God, but it also then is, if something is such a big thing that it's gonna cost you a calf, don't do that thing, right? But if you can afford a calf, then you better be putting forth what you can afford, because a percentage of that as well goes to those who got nothing, because that's also what the priests did, or were supposed to do. Okay? So if you can afford a calf and you give a pigeon, that means that you and your wealth really were not taking care of those who were starving. And if it's all about God, well then, that's a problem, isn't it?
There was one point, though, where it said that the poor should be paying the same amount as the rich, and no more and no less for either one of them.
Well, absolutely. So let's say you're paying 10% of your income. If your income is $10 and you pay 10%, and my income is 10 million and I pay 10%, we are paying the same amount, no more, no less, correct?
Just percentages, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't read that as percentages either.
Yeah, I was just, so there were a few things like that I read it. And then I also was wondering if, like, the translations, so much of it, I'm like, how much of it is lost in translation? Because that hardening the heart thing, that was a linguistic thing with me. I did not catch that at all. I was like, oh.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you should all go to your original Hebrew and read that without problems, right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no. So, but that's when we understand that we pay in equal amounts. In our modern vernacular, we think, well, then we all need to pay in equal amounts. Well, equal means equal. So let's start talking that percentage, right? What does that mean? Let's talk about that tithe. Okay? Yep. Because otherwise God would not be just, would God? Because it would mean nothing to one person, and it would mean so much more and enslavement to another. And that just violates everything Exodus just stood for. So we pulled some of the weeds and we got some big picture stuff. So, yes? All right. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Woohoo! And Scott gets to teach it. So, next week, Leviticus, folks. All right. Dig in and go forth. God bless you all. May the peace and power and love of Christ go with you. And may it bless you and may it bless your reading. Because, wow, you thought there were details in Exodus.
Right.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
I could borrow a children's